They say funerals are never just about the person who has passed, they are mirrors, showing us who the living really are. As I pinned my husband's brooch onto my dress that morning, I felt that truth pressing heavily on my chest. Grief is simple in its pain, but family? Family is complicated. Before I continue, let me ask you, when you've attended funerals, did they bring your family closer or pull hidden tensions to the surface? I would love to hear your perspective in the comments. And if you want more stories that speak to women navigating dignity, loss, and quiet strength, subscribe now. We share new stories every week, and the next one might feel like your own. I walked into the church that day believing I would only have to carry sorrow. Instead, betrayal slipped in like a shadow. My daughter-in-law leaned close during the prayers, her breath cold against my ear, and whispered, "Now we get the house." In that moment, the funeral was no longer just an ending. It was the beginning of a truth I had already prepared for in silence. So, let us get into what happened after that whisper at the funeral, because it has lived in my memory like a line that cut too deep to ignore. I remember sitting on the hard wooden pew, surrounded by the sound of shuffling hymn books and muffled coughs, trying to keep my face steady while my chest burned. People thought I was grieving only my husband, but in truth, I was mourning the loss of respect for my own family. Her words had not been a slip of the tongue. They were calculated, spoken with confidence that no one else would hear. I kept my eyes forward, staring at the altar draped in white, but my thoughts moved backward, unraveling years of choices that had led me to that exact moment. I thought about the house they wanted so badly, how it had been nothing more than a dream when my husband and I were newly married. We lived in a rented room then, 2 windows that barely opened, paint peeling off the walls, and a kitchen so small I could barely turn around. Still, he would hold my hands and tell me we would have something better one day, something we built together. The minister's voice rose, speaking about legacy, about lives that left marks on others. For a second, I almost laughed because legacy seemed to mean one thing to the church and another to my daughter-in-law. To her, it was measured in property deeds and bank accounts. To me, it was measured in scraped knuckles from hammering nails, nights of skipped dinners to make sure the mortgage was paid, and the smell of sawdust that clung to my husband's shirts as we worked side by side. I sat in silence, but my memory did not. It carried me back to the first night we stepped inside the unfinished house. The walls were bare beams, the floors unpolished, and the air smelled of dust and sweat. We laid an old blanket on the floor, shared a single candle, and ate bread and cheese. My husband called it the best meal of his life because it was the first one in a place that belonged to us. I remember looking at him and thinking, this is what it means to fight for something worth keeping. The whisper of my daughter-in-law that day at the funeral felt like someone trying to erase all of that effort in a single breath. I did not answer her. Not then. I let her believe her words had landed, but inside I was already holding on to the knowledge that she was wrong. The house was not hers. It was not even my son's. It was safe, tucked away where greed could not touch it. And in that quiet awareness, I found a small piece of strength, even as my tears rolled silently down my cheeks for the man I had lost. The service moved forward with hymns, but every note reminded me of labor and sacrifice. My husband's favorite hymn was sung with shaky voices, and I closed my eyes, remembering him bent over a pile of lumber, whistling that same tune as he worked in the yard. He never cared much for grand things, but he cared deeply about that home. He would say often, "This house is not just walls and a roof, it is our proof that we made something out of nothing." His voice echoed in my head at that moment, louder than the choir, louder than my daughter-in-law's whisper. After the hymn, people began lining up to offer condolences. My son stood stiffly beside me, offering polite nods. His wife lingered just behind him, her face set in a mask of practiced sorrow, but her eyes restless, scanning the crowd. I could see she was thinking ahead, already imagining what came next after the casket was lowered into the ground. I recognized that look because I had seen it at the dinner table before, when she spoke casually about downsizing, about selling, about using the money for themselves. Back then I had stayed quiet too, but I had also taken note. I accepted hugs, handshakes, and murmured words, but my mind continued to walk through old rooms. I could almost hear the echoes of laughter that once filled the kitchen, the slam of the back door when my son ran in from school, the sound of my husband's boots on the front step. Every memory carried weight. Every detail reminded me that no one else had the right to claim what had been earned through years of persistence. And so, while others thought I was lost in grief, I was silently drawing strength from those memories, like a secret shield around me. There is a strange truth about funerals that few admit. They do not only show us who we have lost, they show us who remains, and how they reveal themselves when they think no one is watching. That day, my daughter-in-law revealed herself in a single sentence. My son revealed himself in silence. And I revealed myself not with words, but with what I had already done long before this day arrived. When the final prayer ended and people rose from their seats, I stayed still for a moment longer. The casket stood at the front, flowers resting on top. I whispered goodbye in my heart, but alongside farewell was another vow. I promised him that what we built together would remain protected, that no one would turn our home into a prize to be divided. The papers were already signed, the deed already safe, but I spoke the promise again anyway, because I wanted him to know it had never been about spite. It was about love, about loyalty, and about honoring the work of two lives joined together. That was the truth I carried with me as I stood to follow the rest of the mourners outside. Grief was heavy, betrayal was bitter, but inside I held something stronger. I held the knowledge that while others thought they had won, the real victory had been secured long before they ever whispered their claim. As the service ended and the crowd moved toward the cemetery, I let my thoughts drift again, pulled back into the earliest years of our marriage, when that house was only a dream we whispered about at night. The walk from the church to the car felt automatic, but my mind was far away, back to a time when we owned nothing more than a set of secondhand chairs and a mattress on the floor. My husband had always said that if we worked hard enough, we could carve out a place that would be ours, something no one could take away. I clung to that belief through the leanest months, when I stood in line at the grocery store with a handful of coins and prayed it would be enough. The first time we saw the small patch of land that would become our home, the grass was wild and uneven, and the fence sagged in places. He squeezed my hand so tight that day and whispered that one day we would raise walls there, walls that carried our story. I remember nights when we spread graph paper across the kitchen table, sketching out how the house might look. We argued playfully about where the bedroom should go, how large the kitchen should be, whether there would ever be enough space for the family we hoped to raise. Sometimes we had nothing more than black coffee for dinner, but those conversations fed us more than any meal could. He wanted a big porch where he could sit in the evenings after work, and I wanted a wide kitchen window that faced the garden. Every line on that paper was more than a plan. It was a piece of our hope stitched together in pencil marks. The day we signed the first papers for that land, my hands shook almost as much as they had at our wedding. We didn't own the house yet, not even close, but the soil beneath our feet felt like the start of a foundation. I still see my husband kneeling down to scoop a handful of dirt, letting it run through his fingers as if he was already testing what it meant to belong to something solid. He worked 2 jobs then, leaving at dawn and returning long after the sun had set. I worked too, typing in an office by day and sewing clothes for neighbors in the evenings. It was never easy, but every tired step forward carried us closer to that house. At the cemetery that day, as the casket was lowered, I could almost hear his laugh from those early years, the way he joked that he was better with a hammer than a pen, but he would sign as many papers as it took to give us that home. I thought about how those memories lived in every corner of that place. No matter how many times my daughter-in-law called it outdated or too much for me to handle, she could never know what it had cost to bring it into being. We moved into the shell of the house before it was finished. The floors were rough and the roof leaked in one corner, but it was ours. I painted the walls myself with cheap brushes until my arms ached, and he fixed what he could with borrowed tools. We learned together, making mistakes, sometimes laughing, sometimes arguing, but always moving forward. It was never perfect, but it was honest, and it was ours. I told myself then that this house was more than shelter. It was proof that we had not been beaten by poverty or doubt. My son was born in that house. His first cries echoed against half-painted walls, and I remember thinking how strange it was that a place could hold both exhaustion and joy so completely at the same time. We wrapped him in blankets sewn from old fabric, and my husband whispered to him that one day he would inherit a place built by his parents' hands. That promise had once filled me with pride. Sitting at the funeral decades later, hearing my daughter-in-law's greedy whisper, it cut me instead. She had no idea what those words once meant. I thought of the nights we nearly lost the place. Once, when my husband was injured and out of work for months, the mortgage payment came due, and we were short. I pawned the gold bracelet my mother had given me, a gift I had sworn never to part with, just to cover the bill. I never told my family at the time because it felt like my burden alone. When I think of that now, I know it was not just a house I protected. It was the life inside it, the meals shared, the laughter carried across its walls. As the priest closed the service with a prayer, I held onto those memories like armor. My daughter-in-law's whisper had not been a revelation. It had only confirmed what I had long suspected, that to her, the house was a prize waiting to be claimed. But she did not know the full story. She did not know about the bracelets sold in desperation, the nights of stitching until dawn, the meals missed so the mortgage could be met. She did not know because she never asked, and perhaps she never cared. When the crowd began dispersing, I stood back a moment, watching my son shake hands, his smile polite but empty. He looked tired, not from grief, but from being caught between two women who both shaped his life in different ways. I wondered if he remembered the nights he had fallen asleep in my lap while I balanced bills at the kitchen table. I wondered if he ever understood that the roof above his head was held up by more than wood and nails. Walking back to the car, I let out a breath I had been holding all morning. The truth was, no matter how loudly they claimed it, the house had already been taken out of their reach. That decision had been made long before this day, in a lawyer's office where I signed papers with hands steadier than they had ever been. I did not tell them then, and I would not tell them yet. But I carried the quiet knowledge that I had honored both my husband's memory and my own dignity by protecting what we built. As the cars pulled away from the cemetery and the quiet returned, I found myself lost again in memories of when the house first began to take shape. The soil was still bare then, the structure no more than a frame of wood rising slowly against the sky. We did not have the money to hire a crew for everything. So much of it came from our own hands, our sweat, and the help of a few kind neighbors who lent their tools and their time. I can still see my husband climbing the ladder with nails in his pocket, hammering in rhythm, determined not to stop until the roof beams stood steady. He was not a builder by trade, but he became one out of necessity. I mixed cement in a wheelbarrow with a shovel, stirring until my arms ached, then carried it in small batches to where it was needed. Every nail, every brushstroke, every scrape on our hands left a mark not just on the walls, but on us. The house grew slowly, but it grew with us. There was a night I will never forget when the rain came pouring down before the roof was sealed. We rushed inside with buckets and pots to catch the drips that slipped through the gaps. Our son, still a toddler, thought it was a game, clapping each time the water splashed into the tin. I remember standing there, soaked, laughing in exhaustion, realizing even in hardship there was joy, because we were building something together. It did not look like much then, but to us, it already felt like home. Once the roof was finished and the walls stood firm, we moved in before the floors were polished. The neighbors shook their heads, saying it was too soon, but we wanted to live inside what we had created. At night we spread blankets on the raw wood, using lanterns for light. It was cold, but there was comfort in knowing the space belonged to us. In the mornings, we cooked simple meals over a stove that barely worked, and we ate sitting on crates because we had no furniture yet. But there was pride in every bite. As I walked through those memories while standing outside the funeral home that day, I thought about how little my daughter-in-law understood. She saw the house as an object, a possession, something to be taken. To me, it was a timeline carved into beams and floorboards. It carried the first words of my son, spoken in the hallway while holding onto the wall for balance. It carried the echoes of arguments and reconciliations, of birthdays where the cake was crooked, but the laughter was full. No money could measure that. I also thought of the setbacks, because the house was never built without struggle. The first winter after we moved in, the pipes froze and burst. Water covered the kitchen floor, and we spent the night mopping with rags, shivering as the wind howled through unfinished windows. I wanted to give up more than once, but each time my husband reminded me that nothing worth keeping ever came easily. He was right, though I did not always see it then. Looking back, I realized the hard days are what made the house matter even more. When my son grew older, he would help paint the porch or hold a flashlight while his father worked. There was a time when he told me, without hesitation, that he wanted to raise his own children in that same house. I wonder now if he remembers saying those words, or if they've been drowned out by his wife's voice. It hurts to think how quickly people forget promises, once made with sincerity. Still, I hold on to the memory because to me it proves that at least once, even he understood what the house truly meant. At the funeral, as people exchanged stories about my husband, I listened politely, but my heart was elsewhere. I kept drifting back to the day we finally installed the front door. My husband carved a small mark on the inside of the frame, a line no one else would notice. He told me it was our proof that we had crossed a threshold together, one no one could close against us. That door still stands. Every time I open it, I see his mark and remember the promise it carried. The daughter-in-law could not have known any of this, but I did, and that was enough. I had taken steps to make sure the house was protected, not just because of her greed, but because of the lifetime built into its walls. As I shook hands with guests at the funeral home, I kept silent about what I had done, but I felt no fear. The truth was secure just as the house was secure. I let her smile in ignorance, because in the end her words had no power over me. That evening, after everyone had left, I sat in my car for a long while before driving home. I closed my eyes and pictured the house waiting for me, quiet but full of memory. I thought about the first night we had crossed its threshold and the promise we made to protect it. I realized then that my decision to sign the papers in my sister's name had not been made out of anger, but out of loyalty. Loyalty to my husband, loyalty to the life we created, and loyalty to myself. When I finally started the car, I felt a strange calm wash over me. Grief was heavy, but so was resolve. The funeral had shown me that some people only see value where money can be made. But I had lived enough years to know real value is not measured in what something can be sold for. It is measured in the work, in the memories, and in the sacrifices hidden inside every brick. When I reached home after the funeral, the house was silent in a way that pressed into me. The air felt heavy, not only with grief, but with the weight of history. I walked through each room, my steps slow, letting memories rise without trying to push them away. That whisper from my daughter-in-law kept circling back, not because of its cruelty, but because of how little she understood what this house had cost us. She thought of it as a prize, but to me, it was built from years of sacrifice layered one on top of another. I remembered one of the hardest seasons we endured. My husband had injured his back and could not work for nearly 6 months. The bills did not stop, and the mortgage payment came due with no mercy. I was working in a small office then, typing reports for little pay, but every cent went toward holding onto the house. At night, I sewed clothes for neighbors, hemming trousers until my fingers cramped. I can still feel the sting of the needle slipping into my skin when I grew too tired. Every stitch was a plea that the bank would not take our home. There was a particular week when we fell short. We needed just enough to cover the payment, but our account was nearly empty. That night, I opened the wooden box where I kept my mother's bracelet, the one she had given me on my wedding day. I turned it over in my hands for hours, torn between memory and necessity. By dawn, I had decided. I walked to the pawn shop, placed it on the counter, and left with enough money to make the payment. I told no one, not even my husband. He never knew that his pride in keeping the house was partly saved by that bracelet. I carried the loss alone, but it was worth it. The house seemed to absorb those sacrifices, holding them in its walls like secrets. Years later, when people complimented the home, I often smiled politely, but inside I remembered what it had taken. They saw paint and furniture. I saw long nights, skipped meals, and hours of labor. Every corner carried proof of how we fought to keep what was ours. As I moved from the kitchen into the living room that evening, I remembered how close we came to losing it again. My husband's illness had grown worse then, and medical bills piled up quickly. There was a point when I thought we might have to choose between treatment and the house. I worked every shift I could take, often leaving before sunrise and returning long after my son was asleep. I used to sit at the table late at night, bills spread out before me, balancing numbers that never seemed to add up. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall felt louder than anything else. One night, I broke down, certain we would lose it all. I remember sitting with my head on the table, tears soaking through the papers. My husband walked in, frail but still steady in his voice, and told me, "We have made it this far, and we will not stop now." His faith carried me when mine faltered. The next day, I found a way to negotiate with the bank for more time, and we scraped by again. That became the rhythm of our life. Fight, falter, then find a way through. It is strange how those struggles became part of the fabric of the house itself. The floorboards and the hallway remind me of the nights I walked back and forth, rocking our son when he was sick, even as exhaustion pulled at me. The small crack by the kitchen window reminds me of the day we argued over money and then made up by cooking together, laughing through frustration. None of those things are visible to anyone else, but to me they are reminders of everything we carried. At the funeral, when my daughter-in-law whispered about the house, she erased all of that in her mind. To her, it was only square footage and market value. She had no idea of the nights I fell asleep with my head on the sewing machine, or the mornings I skipped breakfast so there would be more food on the table for my son. She never cared to ask. That is why I could not let her claim what she did not respect. It would have been a betrayal to my husband, to myself, and to the years we fought to keep these walls standing. As I sat alone that night after the funeral, I thought about the decision I had made in the lawyer's office. Transferring the deed into my sister's name was not easy. It meant admitting that I could not trust my own son to protect what mattered most. But when I looked back at the history of the house, I knew I had done the right thing. I had not signed those papers out of anger. I had signed them out of love for the work we had done and the life we had built. The house had nearly been lost more times than I could count, but each time we pulled it back, it became more than property. It became a record of endurance. That is why, when others see it only as something to sell, I see it as something to guard. Sitting there in the quiet, I whispered to my husband again that I had kept my promise. No one would take it from us, not now, not ever. The next morning after the funeral, I walked through the hallway and paused where the marks on the walls still showed my son's growth through the years. Each line carried a date written in my handwriting, each one proof of a boy who once belonged here fully. Looking at those marks reminded me of when the house was alive with his presence, when his laughter filled the air and his footsteps echoed down the hall. That was before distance crept in, before outside voices reshaped what this place meant to him. I remembered his early years clearly. He would run from room to room, shouting my name just to hear me answer. He used to curl up on the couch beside me when storms shook the windows, and he once told me that the house was the safest place in the world. I held on to that sentence for years, believing it would always be true. In those days, he loved the creak of the stairs, the sound of his father's hammer fixing small things, even the smell of fresh paint when we tried to repair the walls ourselves. To him, this house was more than shelter. It was the center of his world. There was one summer when he begged us to let him camp in the backyard. We set up a small tent, but by midnight he grew frightened and came back inside. He laughed as he admitted he missed his bed, his toys, and the comfort of the house. That night, I realized he felt the same attachment to this place as we did. It was not just where he lived. It was where he felt safe, where he grew, where he belonged. But time has a way of changing how people see things. When he reached adulthood, his visits became shorter, his words more polite than warm. He started to see the house not through the eyes of a child, but through the influence of someone who did not share its history. His wife began to make small comments during family dinners. She would note that the furniture was old, that the roof would need repairs, that the neighborhood was not modern enough. At first, I ignored those remarks, but over time I saw how they began to shape his view. I will never forget the night she suggested that I should consider selling the house. She said it with a smile, as if it were a harmless idea, but her eyes carried something firmer. She spoke of how it was too much space for one woman, how the money could make life easier for all of us. My son sat beside her, silent, his face unreadable. I waited for him to speak, to defend the place he once called safe, but he said nothing. His silence cut deeper than her words. That was the beginning of the shift. From then on, I noticed how he no longer spoke of the house with affection. Instead, he treated it as property, a thing that could be moved or sold when convenient. The boy who once promised me he would never let it go had become a man who let others speak for him. It was painful to watch, but it was also a lesson. It taught me that love for a place can fade when someone chooses not to remember what it once meant. I tried to remind him of the past. I pulled out photo albums showing birthdays, holidays, the day he built his first model car at the kitchen table. He smiled politely, but quickly moved on to other topics. His wife dismissed the albums as clutter, insisting we should throw away what she called unnecessary piles. I gathered them up and put them back on the shelf, refusing to let them be discarded. They were not clutter. They were proof of life lived within these walls. There was one particular evening when he came to visit, and his wife stayed in the car. He walked through the room slowly, almost as if he felt torn. I pointed out the spot on the wall where his first drawing once hung, the dent in the floor where he had dropped a toy so many times. He looked, but his eyes did not soften. It was as if he had already chosen to forget. That night I realized that the house no longer carried the same weight for him, and perhaps it never would again. I do not blame him entirely. Influence is powerful, and his wife has a way of making her voice sound like reason. But I cannot forgive how quickly he let go of what this place once meant. When he sat silent at the funeral as she whispered about taking the house, it confirmed what I already knew. He had chosen silence again, just as he had done at the dinner table years earlier. His silence was not just agreement. It was erasure of the history we built. Walking through the hallway that morning, I pressed my hand against the marks of his childhood and felt a mixture of sorrow and resolve. I could not bring back the boy who once loved this home. I could not change the man he had become, but I could still protect the house itself. That was the decision I had made when I signed the deed into my sister's name. It was not just about keeping it safe from greedy hands. It was about preserving the history that lived in its walls, even if my own son no longer cared to remember it. As I stood there, I thought about how families change. Love can turn into distance, loyalty into silence. But the house remained steady, carrying all of it within its walls. The laughter, the arguments, the promises, and the betrayals. It had held us through storms and through joy, and it would continue to stand even if those who lived within it forgot its meaning. That morning, I realized something important. Protecting the house was no longer just about honoring the past. It was also about guarding myself against the erasure of everything I had worked for. If my son and his wife could not value it, then I had to be the one to ensure it was not lost. It was not spite. It was survival of memory, survival of dignity. As the days passed after the funeral, I could not stop replaying how my daughter-in-law leaned close and spoke with such confidence. That whisper was not born in the moment. It had been planted years ago, growing slowly through the way she had shaped my son's thinking. The more I reflected, the more I realized how steady and deliberate her influence had been. I first met her at a family gathering when my son introduced her as his new girlfriend. She was polite, her smile practiced, and her words chosen carefully. At the time, I thought she was simply nervous. I welcomed her, cooked a meal, and tried to make her feel comfortable. Looking back now, I remember how quickly she shifted the conversation to money, to homes, to how people should think about the future. It struck me as ambitious, but I brushed it aside. I wanted to believe she was only trying to make a good impression. As their relationship grew, her voice became louder in family discussions. She often made small remarks about how old-fashioned my ways were. If I served a meal, she would say lightly that restaurants did things differently now. If I mentioned the house, she would note how difficult it must be for me to keep it running. Those comments seemed harmless at first, but they were steady, always pushing the same idea, that I was out of step and that the house was a burden rather than a blessing. I noticed how my son began repeating her phrases. He would tell me not to tire myself with yard work, or that I should consider downsizing. He said it kindly, but the words were not his. They were hers. My husband saw it too, though he rarely spoke of it. Once, after a family dinner, he leaned toward me and whispered, "She sees the house as a prize. Be careful." His warning stayed with me, though at the time I hoped he was mistaken. Over the years, her influence grew stronger. When my son called, the conversations became shorter, always circling back to their plans, their needs, their vision of what life should be. The house was mentioned often, framed as something that would eventually be theirs. Each time, I felt a small knot form in my stomach. I began to realize they were not waiting to see if I would one day choose to share it. They had already decided it belonged to them. The shift became clear during one particular holiday dinner. She made a comment in front of everyone, suggesting that it was wasteful for me to live in a place with so many rooms. My son laughed nervously, but he did not defend me. I kept my face steady, but inside, I felt the sting. It was no longer a suggestion. It was an announcement. She wanted others to hear her claim, even before it was hers to make. I often wondered what drove her so strongly. Was it greed, or was it simply the way she had been taught to measure worth? She treated the house like a number, a value that could be written on paper. She did not see the walls as I did, or the sacrifices buried within them. She did not know the sound of my son's laughter bouncing off the hallway, or the nights when my husband and I worked late just to keep the lights on. To her, it was all surface, all calculation. What hurt more than her words was my son's silence. Silence became his way of choosing. He never openly said the house should be sold, but he never stopped her when she spoke as if it already was hers. That silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. It told me that he had chosen her voice over mine, her vision over the history that had raised him. I remember one evening when I tried to remind him of the past. We sat in the living room, and I pulled out an old box of his childhood toys. I placed them on the coffee table, hoping the memories would soften him. He smiled faintly, but then he said, "Mom, you can't live in memories forever. Things change." I nodded, but inside I felt the ground shifting. He no longer saw the house as something sacred. He saw it as an obstacle to the life they wanted. That realization was the turning point for me. I knew then that I had to protect the house in a way that did not depend on his understanding. Love for him remained, but trust in his choices faded. My daughter-in-law had made her claim clear, and my son had chosen to let her speak for both of them. From that point on, I began thinking quietly about what steps I could take to ensure the house stayed safe, no matter what they believed. Looking back, I see now that my husband's warning had been right all along. She saw the house as a prize, and she believed she would win it. But what she did not know was that her whisper at the funeral came too late. The papers were already signed. The house had already been placed where her hands could not reach. In that knowledge, I found my calm. In the days following the funeral, family members visited less often, but the tension around the house only grew clearer. It began with a quiet suggestion from my son. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, his fingers tapping against the wood, his eyes avoiding mine. He said gently that perhaps it was time to think about what comes next. I knew exactly what he meant before the words were even spoken. He tried to frame it as concern, saying the house was too large for one woman, that it required upkeep I should not handle alone. But beneath his careful tone, I could hear the echo of his wife's earlier whisper. I listened without interrupting, though my heart tightened with each sentence. He spoke as though he was offering me guidance, but I could see how much of it belonged to her. His words carried her rhythm, her priorities, her view of what mattered. I did not answer him right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch, watching him shift in his seat, waiting for me to agree. Finally, I said simply that the house was not a burden to me. It was my anchor, My proof of a life built and protected. He sighed, frustrated, but before he could continue, the back door opened and his wife stepped in, carrying a tray of food she had bought from a nearby market. She placed it on the counter and looked around the kitchen as if she was already measuring the space, already imagining what could be changed. She complimented the size, then added that it would be easier to sell now while the market was strong. Her voice was firm, though disguised as casual observation. I noticed how my son stayed quiet again, letting her words fill the air. That evening turned into the first open confrontation. She began listing reasons why keeping the house made no sense, why selling would provide security for everyone. I asked her to stop, reminding her that this house was not hers to discuss. She smiled politely, but her eyes did not soften. My son shifted uncomfortably, caught between us, but he never raised his voice or defended me. It was as though he had surrendered his position long ago. Later that night, after they left, I walked from room to room in the dark. I let my hand rest on the furniture, the walls, the doors that had been opened and closed thousands of times. I thought about how quickly they had spoken of selling, as though all of this was nothing more than property. To them, the value was written in numbers. To me, it was written in sacrifices and memories. I whispered to myself that they could talk as much as they wanted, but the truth was already decided. The house was beyond their reach. Still, their pressure did not stop. Over the next week, I received small remarks and phone calls, framed as concern. They suggested moving me into something smaller, closer to them, where life would be easier. I heard the same pattern over and over. It was not about me. It was about control, about claiming something they believed was theirs. I remained polite, but I kept my answers brief. The less I said, the less ground I gave them. One evening, a cousin came to visit and mentioned casually that my daughter-in-law had been speaking about future plans, as though the house was already theirs. My cousin looked uncomfortable even repeating it, but she thought I should know. I nodded and thanked her, though inside my resolve hardened. If my daughter-in-law was confident enough to speak so openly, then she believed nothing stood in her way. That confidence would make the eventual truth even sharper when it came. I kept remembering what my husband once said, that protecting the house was not about bricks and beams, but about preserving what we had built together. I reminded myself of that as I watched my son drift further into silence. I loved him, but love did not mean surrender. I could not let his choices erase everything we had carried through hardship. The decision I had made with the lawyer was not only wise, it was necessary. The confrontation at the kitchen table was the first, but it would not be the last. I knew they would push again, perhaps harder, believing they could wear me down. What they did not know was that I had already prepared for this moment long before it came. Their words might sting, but they no longer carried power over the future of this house. The papers had already been signed. The deed had already been placed in safe hands. As I locked the door that night and turned off the lights, I felt a steady calm settle over me. They could whisper, they could plan, they could speak as if the decision was theirs. But the truth belonged to me, and I had already chosen. A week later, they returned. This time, there was no attempt to wrap their words in soft concern. They arrived together, standing in my living room as though the matter was already settled. My daughter-in-law began first, her tone direct. She spoke about the expenses of maintaining the house, how repairs would pile up, how I deserved something easier. I could hear the faint edge in her voice, the certainty that she was pressing an argument she believed I could not resist. My son stood beside her, nodding slightly, his silence once again louder than anything he might have said. I watched him carefully, waiting for him to step forward and claim his own position, but he stayed behind her words as if they were his shield. I felt the familiar sting of disappointment, but I stayed calm. I knew their push was not about helping me. It was about claiming control of something they thought belonged to them. I let them speak for a long while. I listened as she listed numbers, imagined profits, even spoke about what could be done with the land if the house was torn down. Her confidence grew with each sentence, as though my quiet meant surrender. My son finally spoke, saying that it was not about greed, but about practicality. He said they wanted to make sure things were handled now instead of later. He never once said the house carried meaning to him. He only spoke as if it were an asset to be managed. When he finished, I took a slow breath and answered. I reminded them that this house was not theirs to decide over. I told them I was not overwhelmed, not in need of rescue, and not asking for change. My words were steady, not raised, but I saw the flicker of frustration cross her face. She leaned forward, telling me I was being stubborn, that I was clinging to the past. I held her gaze and said simply that the past was worth holding because it was paid for with years they could never understand. The room grew tense. My son shifted again, clearly wishing to escape the moment, but she would not let it go. She pressed harder, insisting that selling would benefit the whole family. That word, family, struck me deeply. To her, family was a justification for taking. To me, family had once meant protecting. I realized in that moment that we were speaking two different languages, and no amount of reasoning would bring us together. I stood then, walking slowly across the room, letting my hand rest on the back of the chair that had been in the house since the early days. I told them that this home had already been protected, that decisions had already been made. I did not explain further. I only said that whatever plans they imagined would not come to pass, because the house was not within their reach. I left it at that, letting the weight of my words sink in. My daughter-in-law looked startled, then angry. She asked directly what I meant, but I only repeated that the house was safe. My son looked at me then, truly looked, and for a brief second, I saw the boy he once was, the one who used to run down these halls. His face softened, but only for a moment. Then he dropped his eyes and let her speak again. They left shortly after, their frustration clear. She muttered something about me making things harder than they needed to be, and he simply kissed my cheek without meeting my eyes. I watched them walk down the driveway together, their steps quick, their voices low but sharp. The silence in the house afterward felt heavy, but also steady. I had not raised my voice. I had not given in. And they now knew, even if they did not yet understand fully, that something stood between them and their plans. That night, I sat at the table and thought of my husband. I could almost hear him reminding me that strength does not always come from shouting. Sometimes it comes from the calm refusal to move when pushed. I had not told them about the deed being placed in my sister's name, but I knew that truth would surface in time. For now, I was content knowing they were unsettled, uncertain, forced to realize I was not as easy to dismiss as they believed. As I closed the house for the night, turning the locks and shutting the lights, I felt a small peace settle in me. They could push again, and I knew they would, but the house was already safe. They just did not know it yet. The following weekend, they came again, but this time the tone was sharper, the patience gone. I had expected it, and in some ways I welcomed it. Sooner or later, words spoken in whispers always grow louder. When they stepped into the living room, I could see that they had rehearsed what they planned to say. My daughter-in-law wasted no time. She announced that the family needed clarity, that it was irresponsible to let things linger. She claimed decisions about the house had to be made now, not later. I listened calmly, but I saw the way her eyes scanned the room as though she was already making plans in her mind. My son stood beside her, not speaking at first, letting her carry the argument. When he finally did open his mouth, his words sounded like a copy of hers. He said they were trying to make things easier for me, that they only wanted to ensure the house did not become a burden. I could hear the practiced care in his tone, but I also heard the hollowness beneath it. I sat down at the table and asked them both to join me. For a moment they looked surprised, but they took their seats. I folded my hands and let silence stretch between us. Then I asked my son if he remembered the nights he spent building model cars at this very table, or the time he stayed up past midnight painting a project for school. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward his wife. He muttered that he remembered, but his voice carried no warmth. His wife interrupted, brushing off my words as if they were irrelevant. She said memories were not practical, that a house was not meant to be a museum. She leaned forward, pressing that it was time to move forward. That phrase repeated in my mind, move forward. To her, moving forward meant erasing everything that had come before. I looked at my son then, hoping he would see the truth in what I was about to say, but his silence told me he had already chosen where to stand. So I spoke clearly. I told them the house was not theirs to plan around. I explained that steps had already been taken to protect it, that its future was secured beyond their reach. Their faces shifted at once, confusion, disbelief, then anger. My daughter-in-law leaned back, her voice rising, demanding to know what I meant. I repeated only that the house was safe, that it would not be sold, not now and not later. My son looked at me then with a mix of shock and hurt, as if he had never imagined I could act without telling him. He asked what I had done, his voice low but tense. I answered honestly, though without detail. I said the house had been placed in trusted hands, that no matter what they tried, it would not pass into theirs. The room grew heavy with silence after that. She stood abruptly, pacing, saying I had betrayed the family. She accused me of turning against them, of choosing outsiders over my own. I did not raise my voice in reply. I simply told her that family is not built on taking, but on respect. If she could not understand that, then she had never been part of the family to begin with. My son flinched at those words, but he did not speak in her defense. The confrontation ended with them leaving quickly, their steps hard against the floor, their car pulling out of the driveway faster than it should have. I stood at the window, watching them go, my hands steady even though my heart felt heavy. It was not easy to say what I had said, but it was necessary. For too long, I had allowed silence to speak for me. That night, I found my voice again. When the house grew quiet, I walked from room to room once more, letting my fingers trace the marks of years past. I thought of my husband and the warning he had given me long ago, and I felt a small measure of comfort knowing I had listened. The papers had been signed, the deed secured in my sister's name. Whatever storms might come next, the foundation was already protected. The silence after their last visit lingered for several days, but I knew it would not last. When people believe something belongs to them, they do not stop easily. I was right. A week later, a letter arrived. It was from a lawyer hired by my son and his wife, asking to discuss the estate and its future. I held the paper in my hands for a long while, reading every line carefully. They believed the house was already theirs to claim, and they wanted legal confirmation. Instead of fear, I felt a strange calm. I had been preparing for this for years. The decision to sign over the deed had not been made in anger or haste. It had been deliberate, quiet, and final. The letter only proved how necessary that choice had been. I folded it neatly and placed it on the table, then called my sister. When she answered, I explained what had arrived. Her voice was steady, reassuring me that everything was in order. The house was in her name, legally protected. No letter, no argument, no demand could change that now. When my son came later that evening, he looked more unsettled than before. He asked directly if I had really done what he suspected. I did not look away. I told him the truth. Yes, the deed was no longer mine. It had been placed in my sister's name, safe from anyone who would try to treat it like property instead of memory. He stared at me in disbelief, struggling to form words. His wife, who had followed him in, erupted in anger, calling me selfish and untrustworthy. I let her speak, letting her anger spill out across the room. When she was finished, I told them both that I had acted to protect the sacrifices of a lifetime. I reminded my son of the nights we nearly lost the house, of the meals I skipped so he would have enough, of the bracelet I pawned quietly so the bank would not take our home. I told him that those sacrifices were written into the walls, and that I would not let them be erased. For the first time in many years, my son raised his voice. He said I had betrayed him, that I had cut him out without trust. His words shook, filled with pain more than rage. I listened, then answered as gently as I could. I said that trust is built on respect, and he had shown none when he let his wife speak for both of them, when he stayed silent as she claimed the house at his father's funeral. That silence had forced my hand. The room grew quiet after that. My daughter-in-law stormed out, her footsteps sharp against the floor. My son remained, sitting heavily in the chair across from me. For a long moment he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. He admitted he had allowed himself to be carried along, that he had chosen the easier path of silence rather than conflict. He asked if there was any way to undo what I had done. I shook my head. The decision was final, and it had to be. He lowered his eyes, and I felt both sorrow and relief. I had not wanted to hurt him, but I could not allow him to take part in erasing everything his father and I had built. Protecting the house meant protecting myself, even if it meant creating distance between us. That night, after he left, I walked through the house again. But this time the silence felt different. It did not feel heavy with fear. It felt steady, almost peaceful. The walls, the furniture, the photographs, they were safe. My husband's memory was safe. My own sacrifices were safe. I whispered to myself that I had kept my promise, that the house would not fall into hands that saw it only as money. In the weeks that followed, the arguments faded. They knew the truth now. There was nothing left for them to fight over. My sister reassured me often, reminding me that the choice I had made was not just practical, but right. In time, my son began to visit again, though less often, and always without the same certainty in his tone. There was a distance between us now, but there was also an honesty that had not been there before. He knew where I stood, and he knew he could no longer silence me with his silence. Protecting the house had come at a cost, but it was a cost I was willing to bear. In choosing to place it beyond their reach, I had chosen dignity over surrender, memory over greed, and truth over silence. As I sat alone in the house that night, I realized the struggle was not only about property. It was about dignity, about proving that silence does not mean surrender. Too often, women of my age are treated as though our choices no longer matter, as if our years of sacrifice can be traded away without a word. But I hope you felt what I felt in this story, that protecting what you've built is not selfishness, it's survival. It's claiming the right to be seen, even when others try to erase you. And maybe this story feels familiar to you. Maybe you, too, have been dismissed, told you were clinging to the past, or pressured to give up something that was yours. If so, I want you to remember this. You are not powerless, and your history cannot be measured in dollars or convenience. But sometimes the world delivers a twist we never expect. Imagine being told the life you built, the memories you cherished, were nothing but junk. And then, discovering the truth that the very things others threw away held a value they could never imagine. Stay with me, because that story is next.